She walked into the bank with confidence. Successful, respected, a woman who had built everything with her own hands. Yet within moments the room grew colder, eyes shifted. Doors that should have opened stayed firmly shut. Not because of her status, not because of her success, but because of something far more painful, something she could never change. What happened next was not just humiliation, it was a moment that exposed the deep cracks in a system many still deny. And in less than an hour, the tables would turn in a way no one saw coming. But how? And at what cost? The day began like any other, which is what made what followed so jarring. For her, mornings were a time of order, quiet focus, and rituals that anchored her life in discipline. She rose early, long before the noise of the city stirred awake. The kettle whistled softly as she poured herself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the room. On her counter, the laptop hummed with new messages, each subject line a reminder of her responsibilities. To many, this might have felt like a burden. Still, to her, it was a life she had earned, a life she had built with resilience, persistence, and an unshakable belief in herself. She was a CEO, but those 3 letters hadn't come easily. They carried stories of late nights, sacrifices, and the kind of battles people rarely saw. She had climbed ladders others had tried to pull away from under her feet, broken ceilings that had been meant to contain her, and fought against stereotypes that shadowed her at every turn. She was indeed proud of the title. Still more than that, she was proud of what it represented. Proof that someone like her, a black woman, could rise above barriers that were never designed for her success. Her company wasn't just a business, it was a vision. She employed dozens of people, mentored young entrepreneurs, and reinvested in her community. For every setback she had faced, she had created an opportunity, not only for herself, but for others who followed in her footsteps. Her staff admired her. Competitors respected her. To anyone watching from the outside, she had it all: wealth, influence, and recognition. Yet beneath it all was a quiet awareness, an unspoken truth she carried with her. No matter how high she climbed, there would always be those who only saw her skin before they saw her success. That morning, however, she didn't dwell on such thoughts. She slipped into her car, the leather interior warm from the sunlight spilling through the windshield. Her calendar was packed, but she thrived in that rhythm. Meetings, calls, strategy sessions, every minute accounted for, every moment purposeful. On her agenda was a stop at the bank, nothing out of the ordinary. It was supposed to be quick, just another task in a long list of tasks. She even hummed softly to herself as she drove, the city's energy pulsing around her. The streets bustled with people rushing to work, parents walking children to school, and buses hissing at crowded stops. Life unfolded with its usual pace, unremarkable and familiar. She loved these sights. The city, for all its flaws, was her home. She had built her empire here, brick by brick, day by day. As the glass towers loomed into view, she turned into the parking lot of the bank. It was a building she had visited countless times before, its polished stone exterior reflecting the morning sun. She had accounts here, relationships with staff, and records that spoke for themselves. For her, banks were partners, allies in building futures. Today, she only needed to handle some routine business before heading to her next meeting. She gathered her documents, straightened her jacket, and stepped out of the car. The click of her heels echoed against the pavement as she approached the doors. People glanced at her as they passed, taking note of her confident stride and the way she carried herself with authority. She didn't need to announce who she was. Her presence spoke volumes. But as her hand touched the glass door and pushed it open, a shift began. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The cool air of the lobby washed over her, carrying with it the sterile scent of polished floors and freshly printed paper. Behind the counters, employees moved with mechanical efficiency, their voices a low hum blending into the background. Yet, as she entered, something changed in the atmosphere. Eyes flickered toward her, brief, sharp glances that lingered a second too long before darting away. She felt it in the weight of silence that seemed to thicken around her, in the faint but unmistakable tension in the room. She had walked into countless rooms like this before, and she knew the feeling well. It was the invisible line, the unspoken question, who is she? Why is she here? She ignored it, as she always did. She moved toward the counter with purpose, her documents neatly stacked in her hand. To her, this was business, professional, straightforward. But beneath that calm exterior, a seed of unease began to stir. Something about today felt different. Before the incident unfolded, before humiliation and injustice sharpened the air, there was only this, an ordinary woman on an ordinary day, stepping into a bank to handle ordinary tasks. Yet, even in the most ordinary of moments, history has a way of reminding us that prejudice waits quietly, ready to rear its head. She stood in line, her eyes drifting over the polished walls, the posters boasting words like trust, partnership, and respect. Irony. She wondered, not for the first time, if the people who designed those posters ever considered how hollow they might sound to those who had lived through exclusion. Her phone buzzed lightly in her purse, a reminder of her upcoming meeting. She smiled to herself, thinking about the team waiting for her, the plans they would discuss. This stop at the bank was just a pause in the momentum of her day. At least that's what she believed. What she didn't see were the subtle exchanges behind the counter. The glance from one teller to another, the faint frown, the whispered words. What she didn't know was that her success, her title, her achievements, none of it would matter in the next few minutes. Because in their eyes, something else mattered more. Something she could not shed, no matter how much she accomplished. And so the stage was set. She was ready for a transaction. The bank was prepared for something else entirely. The room, still calm on the surface, buzzed with a quiet undercurrent she couldn't yet name. She adjusted her jacket, tightened her grip on the documents, and prepared to step forward when her turn came. Her story was about to shift, not with a loud explosion, not with sudden chaos, but with something deceptively small, a refusal, a denial. A moment so ordinary in appearance, yet extraordinary in its implications. It would cut deeper than she expected, because it was more than just about money, accounts, or services. It was about identity, dignity, and the unsettling reality that even the most successful among us are not immune to the weight of prejudice. She had walked into the bank that morning as a leader, a visionary, a CEO respected by many. But in the next few breaths, she would be reminded, painfully, that to some she was still only one thing. This was the calm before the storm, the fragile quiet before the walls of dignity would be tested. She didn't know it yet, but her life, her reputation, and her patience were about to collide in a moment that would not only define her day, but would echo far beyond the glass walls of that bank. And as she waited for her turn, the seconds ticking by, the world outside continued in blissful ignorance. People walked, talked, lived, and hurried past, never knowing that just inside these walls, a confrontation was about to unfold, one that would expose truths many prefer to forget, because sometimes The most powerful storms don't announce themselves with thunder. They begin quietly with a door opening, a line forming, and a silence heavy enough to shatter. She stepped forward when her turn came, holding her documents with quiet confidence. On the surface, it was a routine moment, another customer approaching a counter. But beneath the fluorescent lights, tension began to coil like a tightening rope. The teller, a young man with neatly pressed clothes and a polite mask of professionalism, looked up at her. His eyes flicked over her face, her skin, and then dropped to the papers in her hand. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm, steady. The voice of someone used to commanding rooms far larger than this. She slid the documents across the counter. "I'm here to process a transfer for my business account." The teller glanced at the papers, then back at her. A pause. Too long. "Business account?" he repeated, as if the phrase itself required verification. "Yes," she replied, leaning forward slightly. "I'm the CEO of Redwood Enterprises. The account should be under my name." Another pause. The man's eyes narrowed just enough for her to notice. He flipped through the documents with deliberate slowness. Behind her, the lines shuffled, a cough breaking the silence. She felt the subtle shift of people watching, waiting. "I'll need to check with my manager," the teller finally said. His tone clipped. He pushed the documents back toward her without meeting her gaze. Her brow furrowed. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes transfers required clearance. But there was something in his voice, something she recognized. Not caution, not professionalism. Something colder. Minutes stretched. She stood, waiting, while whispers floated just loud enough to reach her ears. "Do you think she really owns a company?" someone muttered. "Looks suspicious to me." Another snickered. Her grip on the documents tightened. She had lived through this before, judged, doubted, dismissed. But here, in this moment, her patience thinned. She was not just another customer. She was a client with significant holdings. She had been promised respect. The manager emerged, a woman in a stiff blazer, her lips pressed in a practiced smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. The CEO introduced herself again and explained her request clearly. The manager's smile faltered only slightly, but her eyes told another story. They scanned her up and down, lingering just long enough to make their judgment clear. "I'm afraid we can't process this transfer without further verification," the manager said. "What kind of verification?" the CEO asked. The answer came rehearsed. "We'll need additional proof of ownership, additional identification, and verification from the account's original setup." Her stomach sank. She had already provided all of that. Every document in her hand was complete, signed, and verified. She had been through this process before. She knew the requirements, and she had met them. "This is everything your bank requested," she replied, keeping her tone measured. "I've done transfers larger than this without issue." The manager's smile thinned. "Policy changes," she said. Something sharp twisted in her chest. "Policy changes. It was always some version of that. Some invented barrier, some invisible wall built on prejudice." Behind her, the line grew restless. She could hear sighs, murmurs, the subtle suggestion that she was holding things up. The air pressed in heavy, stifling. "Ma'am," the manager said finally, her voice dipped in false patience. "Perhaps you'd like to try another branch." It landed like a slap. "Not here, not this branch." "Not with us." The CEO straightened her shoulders. "I've banked here for years," she said firmly. "My company invests heavily through this institution. I expect to be treated with the same professionalism as any other client." For a moment, silence. The teller shifted uncomfortably. The manager's smile froze. Then, with a voice so cold it made her chest tighten, the manager replied, "We reserve the right to refuse service." The words cut deep. Around her, eyes widened, whispers grew louder. A refusal. Not because of missing paperwork, not because of an actual policy shift, but because of who she was. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Humiliation burned hot in her chest. She wanted to shout, to demand answers, to remind them who she was and what she had achieved. But the weight of the moment pressed down harder. If she raised her voice, they would call her angry. If she protested too fiercely, they would label her difficult. So she stood in silence, every muscle rigid, her dignity held in place by sheer willpower. Then, quietly, she gathered her documents and stepped back from the counter. Behind her, a man muttered, "Figures?" Another chuckled. The air was suffocating. She walked toward the glass doors, her heels clicking sharply, each step carrying the weight of anger she refused to show. As the doors opened, sunlight hit her face, but it did nothing to warm her. The city buzzed outside, oblivious to the storm that had just struck her heart. Injustice has a way of hollowing out even the strongest souls. She had faced bias before, but this was different. This was a direct attack on her identity, her dignity, her success. And it wasn't just the refusal. It was the smug certainty on the manager's face, the whispered judgment of strangers, the casual dismissal of everything she had worked for. She climbed into her car, her hands trembling as she gripped the wheel. For a moment she sat in silence, her reflection staring back at her in the rearview mirror. She had built empires, inspired communities, changed lives. Yet here she was, reduced to a stereotype in less than 10 minutes. Her phone buzzed again. A message from her assistant. "Are you on your way?" "The team is waiting." She stared at the screen. The team, her people, the ones who looked up to her, who trusted her, who believed in her leadership. A fire lit inside her chest. She would not let this moment pass. She would not allow them to strip her of dignity without consequence. Her mind raced. She remembered every insult, every dismissal, every door slammed in her face during her rise. And now, in this moment, all of it funneled into a sharp, unshakable resolve. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. But this drive would not be ordinary. It would be the beginning of something far greater. As she pulled from the parking lot, the weight of what had happened pressed down on her. But so did something else, something powerful. Her humiliation was transforming into fuel, every doubt and every insult stoking a fire that would not be put out. She thought of her staff back at the office, waiting for her. The young interns saw her as a role model, the managers who admired her decisions, the employees whose livelihoods were tied to her vision. What message would she send them if she allowed this insult to pass unchallenged? Her knuckles whitened on the wheel as she whispered to herself, almost like a vow, "They will not forget this day." The road stretched ahead, bright with morning sun, but in her heart, storm clouds gathered. She could almost hear the echo of the manager's voice. "We reserve the right to refuse service." It looped in her mind like a taunt. Every mile she drove, her anger sharpened into clarity. This was no longer about her transfer. This was no longer about a single bank branch. This was about dignity stolen, respect denied, and justice that demanded to be served. And as she turned down the street that led to her headquarters, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The story wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Aisha sat in her car long after the glass doors of the bank had closed behind her. The city outside was alive with noise, horns blaring, tires screeching, laughter echoing from a nearby cafe. But in her world, silence pressed in like a heavy fog. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, yet she hadn't turned the ignition. Instead, she replayed every moment. The smirk on the teller's face, the security guard's stance, the other customers who averted their eyes as though pretending they hadn't witnessed humiliation unfold right before them. For years, Aisha had endured subtle slights, the way colleagues sometimes second-guessed her ideas until someone else repeated them, the way shopkeepers shadowed her through aisles while smiling politely, pretending it was just a coincidence. Even as a child, she remembered how teachers praised her intelligence with surprise in their voices, as if brilliance didn't belong in someone who looked like her. But today, in that sterile bank lobby, the cruelty wasn't subtle. It was blatant. Stripped of all disguise, her phone buzzed beside her. It was her younger brother, Kareem. She hesitated, knowing the tremble in her voice would betray her. But she answered anyway. "Hey, sis, you sound off. Everything okay?" The letter shook in Aisha's hands. The words blurred, but the meaning was clear. Retract your statement or face legal consequences. The bank wasn't just dismissing her. They were threatening to crush her. Her chest tightened, breath shallow. This wasn't a simple insult anymore. This was a war. A battle where one side had teams of lawyers, corporate influence, and money to burn, and the other side was just her, standing alone with nothing but her truth. She sat frozen, letter trembling as fear crawled into her bones. What if she lost everything? What if her company's reputation crumbled? What if they sued her into silence, dragged her name through courtrooms, erased her voice forever? But another voice whispered inside her. They want you to be afraid. That's their weapon. The weight of history pressed down. Her grandmother's stories, her mother's struggles, her own years of subtle cuts and wounds. Every injustice had brought her here, to this moment where she had to choose. Retreat into silence, or stand taller against the storm. She folded the letter slowly, her fear hardening into resolve. If they wanted a fight, she would give them one. That night, she stood on a stage at a local community center, lights glaring, cameras rolling. The crowd was larger than she'd imagined. Neighbors, activists, students, strangers holding signs that read, "Justice for All." Her voice shook at first, but then it grew. She told them everything. The humiliation, the cold dismissal, the letter meant to scare her into silence. Each word poured out like fire, igniting the crowd. Gasps, murmurs. Applause rose until it roared like thunder. In that moment, Aisha wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every person who had been told, "You imagined it?" Every voice silenced. But even as she stood tall, a chill ran down her spine. Because in the back of the hall, half hidden in shadow, she noticed them. Two men in dark suits, arms crossed, eyes locked on her. They weren't there to listen. They were there to watch. And as the cheers filled the hall, Aisha realized something terrifying. The bank hadn't just threatened her on paper. Now they were following her in person. The bank hadn't spoken its last word. And soon they proved it. One morning, Aisha woke to find her name plastered across headlines. CEO fabricates discrimination story. Bank denies allegations of racism. The words hit like blows, her heart hammering as she scrolled. Her own narrative had been twisted, reframed to make her look like the aggressor, the liar, the one grasping for attention. The smear campaign was brutal. Anonymous sources, misquoted statements, reporters showing up at her office uninvited, cameras flashing as if she were a criminal on trial. Emails poured in, some offering support, others laced with venom. Go back where you came from. Stop stirring trouble. And then, the worst blow, her investors called. Some were panicked, afraid the scandal would ruin the company's reputation. Others hinted at pulling out entirely if she didn't retract her words. The very foundation of her career, the empire she had built with sweat and sacrifice, trembled on the edge of collapse. That night, Aisha sat alone in her office, city lights flickering in the glass behind her. Papers were scattered across the desk, her achievements, her contracts, her dreams. She pressed her hands against her face, her body shaking with exhaustion. For the first time, she wondered if she had made a mistake, if speaking the truth had been worth this unbearable cost. But then she remembered the woman by her car, the trembling voice that had said, "I thought it was my fault." She thought of every silent victim who never had the chance to speak. Her fear began to shift into something sharper: anger, determination. The next day, she marched into the bank itself. Cameras followed, journalists, activists, ordinary citizens drawn by her courage. The lobby was the same sterile white it had been the day they humiliated her. Only this time, she wasn't alone. She stood before the crowd, her voice rising, echoing off marble walls. They wanted me to be silent. They wanted me to shrink. But what happened here wasn't just about me. It's about every person who has been treated like their humanity is negotiable. Today I say no more. The room erupted in applause, chants echoing outside the glass doors. For once, the bank couldn't hide behind polished statements and legal threats. The world was watching. And then it happened. The manager of that branch stepped forward, face pale, sweat beading at his temples. He tried to speak, but the words faltered. Cameras zoomed in. The silence stretched. In that moment, the pressure cracked him open. He admitted that Aisha's treatment hadn't been an isolated event, that it had happened before. Those complaints had been buried, staff protected, and customers silenced. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The truth, finally spoken, rang louder than any denial. For Aisha, the moment was overwhelming. Years of fear, of silence, of quiet humiliation, all crashing into this single turning point where the system itself trembled. But as the cheers rose and cameras flashed, Aisha knew the fight wasn't over. If anything, this was the most dangerous moment yet, because now she wasn't just a woman with a story. She was a symbol, and symbols are the hardest to silence. The crowd outside the bank swelled until the streets pulsed with voices, chants rolling like thunder, signs held high, phones raised to capture every second. What had begun as Aisha's solitary stand had become something far larger, far louder, far more dangerous. Police arrived within minutes. Sirens cut through the air, lights flashing red and blue across the glassy facade. Officers formed a line, their shields glinting in the sun, their presence heavy with an unspoken warning. Disperse, or face the consequences. Aisha's chest tightened. She had seen this before, in headlines, in videos that went viral for all the wrong reasons. Peaceful protests turned violent in an instant. She knew how fragile this moment was. One shove, one raised voice too sharp, and the crowd could become chaos. She stepped forward, palms raised, voice steady despite the tremor in her stomach. "We are not here to destroy. We are here to be heard." Her words rippled through the protesters, calming some, grounding others. But the tension didn't ease. The officers didn't move. Suddenly, from the crowd, a bottle arced through the air, shattering against the pavement at the officer's feet. The sound cracked the silence like a whip. Gasps, screams. The line of shields shifted forward. Aisha's heart pounded. She shouted, "Stop! This is not what we came for." But her voice was drowned out by the roar of voices and the surge of bodies pressing closer. Fear tore through her. This wasn't supposed to happen, not like this. An officer's voice boomed through a megaphone. "Disperse immediately!" The crowd answered with defiance. The air grew hot, charged, as if the city itself held its breath. And then it happened. An officer pushed forward, hand reaching for his baton. The crowd recoiled, then surged, people stumbling and screaming as they raised their phones high to capture the unfolding storm. Aisha was caught in the crush, shoved from all sides, her feet barely finding ground. She stumbled, falling to her knees on the cold pavement. For a moment the world blurred, shoes and legs and shouting all around her. A hand reached down, pulling her up. It was Eliza, her quiet colleague and supporter. "Aisha, you can't stop now," she cried over the chaos. "They need you to stand." Her knees shook as she rose, but her voice found new strength. She climbed onto the steps of the bank, towering above the turmoil, her figure silhouetted against the flashing lights. "Listen to me," she screamed, her throat raw, her voice breaking through the storm. "They want us to fight each other. They want us to lose control so they can silence us. But we are stronger than that. We stand in peace, we stand in truth, and we will not be erased." The words rang out, cutting through the noise. For a moment, the crowd froze. The chants softened, the shoving stilled. Even the officers hesitated. Aisha's voice carried like a lifeline, binding the people back together. But even as calm trickled back, danger still loomed. One officer had his hand on his holster, eyes locked on Aisha as if she were the enemy, not the leader trying to keep peace. Her breath caught, chest tightening as the world seemed to narrow to that single image. The weight of his hand on the weapon, the thin line between survival and tragedy. Everything slowed. The chants faded into a low hum. The city seemed to hold its breath. One wrong move, one flick of his wrist, and her story could end not as a symbol of hope, but as another name in a long list of injustice. Her voice shook, but she refused to step back. "If you want to silence me, then do it now. But know this, my voice is not mine alone. It belongs to every person you've tried to erase. And voices do not die." The officer's hand tightened, then loosened. His arm dropped slowly to his side. The crowd erupted in cries of relief, of defiance, of victory. Aisha stood trembling, tears burning her eyes, knowing the fight was far from over. But in that single moment, she had faced the abyss and refused to bow, and as the chants of justice shook the streets, Aisha realized something life-altering. She had not just survived the storm, she had become the storm. He made it home that night, but nothing felt the same. The street that had always been familiar now carried shadows heavier than the darkness itself. Each step he took echoed in his chest, a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. When he finally closed the door behind him, he leaned against it and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Safe, yes, but scarred in a way no one could see. That night, he barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashing lights, heard the echo of that command, "Hands up!" and felt the weight of every eye that judged him without knowing him. The ceiling above him blurred as questions swirled. Why me? What did I do? How many others had walked this same road and never made it home? The days after were harder still. At work, he plastered on a smile, but inside he was still shaking. His friends noticed, his family worried, yet when he tried to explain, the words never seemed enough. How could he describe the feeling of being treated like a threat in your own skin? How could he put into language the terror of realizing that survival, for him, was never guaranteed? But what hurt most wasn't just his own experience. I realized how common it was. When he shared his story quietly with others, they nodded, not in shock, but in recognition. They had stories, too. Different streets, different uniforms, but the same look in their eyes when they spoke, the look of someone who had been forced to see how little their life was valued. That was the deeper wound, knowing he wasn't alone because this wasn't an accident. It was a pattern, and that pattern stretched far beyond him. The headlines on the news, the names that trended for days before fading into silence, the protests that filled the streets, all were echoes of the same story, repeated again and again. His moment of fear was deeply rooted in generations of injustice. He was just one chapter in a book that was still being written, one voice among millions demanding to be heard. As he sat with that truth, something began to shift inside him. Fear still lived in his bones, yes, but so did resolve. He realized he had a choice, to let that night define him as a victim, or to use it as fuel to stand louder, speak clearer, and refuse silence. Because silence was precisely what allowed the cycle to keep turning, so he started small. He spoke to friends, neighbors, and anyone willing to listen. He joined conversations in community spaces where others carried their own scars. He realized that every story shared was a spark, and sparks together could start a fire. He learned that even in the face of hate, unity was a weapon. But still, one question haunted him. How many more? How many more people would walk home one night and never return? How many more families would bury their loved ones too soon, only to see the world move on as if nothing happened? How many more warnings would have to be given to children about what to do if they were stopped, before those warnings weren't needed anymore? The weight of those questions was heavy, but it was also a call to action. Because if one story could move a heart, 1,000 stories could move a nation. And if millions spoke together, perhaps even the world would have no choice but to listen. In the end, his life didn't end that night. But it changed. Forever. He carried the fear, yes, but he also had a fire within him. And maybe that's what survival really meant. Not just making it through, but refusing to let injustice break you into silence. This story isn't just about him. It's about all of us. Every neighbor, every friend, every stranger who deserves to walk home without fear. It's about the simple truth that no one's skin should ever decide their fate. And yet here we are. So I'll leave you with this. How many more? How many more names? How many more stories before change becomes not just a dream, but a reality? And when the following story is written, will we say we did something, or that we looked away? Because change doesn't start with someone else. It begins with us, with listening, with speaking and refusing to be silent. The question is no longer if the world will change. It's when. And perhaps more importantly, it's who will help make it happen. Maybe that's you. Perhaps it's all of us. But it must begin now.